Our next speaker is Professor Adam Shinar from Reichman University. Adam is an expert in constitutional law, comparative constitutional law. He meant to talk, he wanted to talk about censorship, a nice paper which he gave at our seminar a few weeks ago in Haifa, but he will talk about this very interesting perspective of resisting from within. What is the law with regard to, I understand, state workers and the resistance to orders of an unauthorized government, unjustified.
Okay, it's fine. Okay, thank you very much. And what I want to talk about indeed is something completely different, and I will also try as best as I can not to talk about Israel or not to talk about the reforms or anything that's going on, but to talk conceptually about something else. Usually when we think about resistance, whether it's violent or non-violent, doesn't matter right now, we think about this paradigmatic situation where there is a person who is a citizen of the state, and that person is resisting a particular order that comes from the state. It doesn't matter from where in the state, but that's the paradigmatic case of conscious subjection. It's a paradigmatic case of civil resistance. But we forget to talk about something else that is or can be just as important, and that is to look at what's happening inside the state, right? Not to look at resistance, whether violent or non-violent, as a situation pitting a citizen against a state, but to look at what's happening inside the state and resistance within the state or within a particular apparatus in the state against a different apparatus in the state. And I'll just give a couple of examples from the 20th century and the 21st century. Hopefully, I think they're familiar, but they're examples of this type of phenomenon that I'm speaking about. So one case where this happened, for example, was the resistance to the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education that ordered desegregation of schools in the South. And what happened, at least in the 10 or so years after that decision, was massive resistance, not by citizens, by parents, by teachers, by resistance by the state itself, by the southern states themselves, to the order by the Supreme Court. Now, so that's a case of official resistance, of resistance from inside the state or from one state apparatus to the federal apparatus. A different example, which is a more recent example, which some of you might have heard of, is something that happened in 2004 also in the United States, when same-sex marriages were not, before they became constitutional by the Supreme Court, they were not. And San Francisco decided to issue marriage permits or marriage licenses to gay and lesbian LGBT couples, even though at the same time, the law in California explicitly held that marriage can only be between a man and a woman. And the mayor of San Francisco back then was Gavin Newsom. Today he's actually the governor, but he said, okay, fine, I understand that's the law in California, but I'm the mayor of San Francisco and I'm going to give marriage permits notwithstanding the law in California that I'm, of course, bound by. And in Israel, there's also a famous example, which dates back to the 1970s, I guess, which was when Chaim Cohen was the attorney general. He said, well, I understand that there's this sodomy offense against consensual homosexual sex. However, I, as an attorney general, I choose not to enforce it or not to prioritize it. And I have instructed the police and the state attorney's office not to prosecute such behavior, even though, of course, on the law, it was on the books and they had to, supposedly had to enforce it. Now, all of these are very different examples, but all of them talk about resistance to the law or to a Supreme Court decision or to a type of order. But all of these resistances are happening from within the state. However, all or almost all of the theories that discuss civil resistance or conscious subjection or law violation, all of them only consider the relationship between the state and the citizen. That's one thing. And the second is that all these theories have a very simplistic view of what the state is. They look at the individual who's doing the resisting. It could be a soldier. It could be an individual who's not a soldier. But they see the state as this unitary, coherent structure that only speaks in one voice. It's always a person against the state, as if the state is something instead of many, many different things. And all of these theories that talk about resistance or counter subjection also care very little about what norm is being violated. For them, it doesn't really matter if the norm that is violated is a law or a type of regulation or a city ordinance or a court decision. All of that doesn't matter in all of these theories. And what's unique about official resistance within the state is that it actually does think about these things and takes these differences into account and thinks about them theoretically and what those generate. And the premise for thinking about this in this way is that the relationship between the citizen and the state is very different from the relationship between the official and the state. And actually, if you look at the literature, when people think about officials, at least the sort of the more, I guess, old conception of officials, is they usually think of people who are just following orders, right? So Henry David Thoreau, when he talked about civil disobedience in Walden, he talks about officials as wooden men of wood, who have no desire of their own, or people who serve the devil without intending it as a god. Or if you look at Weber's conception of bureaucracy, of formal rationality, right? There's very little agency that Weber accords to the particular official. All these officials are just acting uniformly and equally and non-discriminatingly to apply the law evenly and treat like cases alike. But they have no agency of their own other than the function of doing what the state wants them to do. However, officials are actually not at all like Henry David Thoreau thought about them, and they're not at all like Max Weber thought about them. And they are different from the citizen. And at the same way, first of all, the official's role, it doesn't really matter which official we're talking about right now, is to apply the law and to administer the law, but they think of themselves as different. Many public officials think of themselves not just as bureaucrats or as pencil pushers. They see themselves as serving the public interest, and they view applying the law as part of this idea of the public interest. But they also have a special relationship with the state that doesn't exist when it comes to regular citizens. Regular citizens, for example, never take an oath to say, I will abide by the laws and I swear allegiance to the laws, right? They don't have, I mean, I never did that at least. Officials do. They take a special oath to uphold the Constitution or to apply the laws. And so they're already positioned in a certain voluntarist way vis-a-vis the state in the way that citizens are not. So that's one thing. And all of this has very little mention or account in either the legal literature or the political literature or the philosophical literature that talks about resistance, which it completely overlooks all of these types of cases. And what matters in addition to all of these things is that, of course, the consequences of officials resisting the law will be very different from regular citizens who resist the law. For regular citizens who resist the law, well, there are a lot of things you can do to them, right? You can bring them to court, you can convict them, you can send them to jail, you can fine them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't view this usually as a threat to the rule of law itself. However, when somebody from inside the state decides not to apply the law, all of a sudden, the project of the rule of law, the project of legal certainty, the project of legal stability is threatened, because there you have the state not applying, or at least not always applying, what it's supposed to do. So it brings into question the legitimacy of the state in a way that regular disobedience doesn't. So if we do talk about Israel, for example, now we'll have maybe some sort of resistance. There will be several dozens or hundreds of people who will not volunteer for reserve duty. And, we can lament this and say this is very bad, but in a way, it doesn't call into question the legitimacy of the state, at least not so much as if significant people from inside the state would say, police officers would say, I'm not going to enforce the law. Or people who work in the Ministry of Interior who are saying, I'm not going to enforce the law, etc. The scope will be different, and the consequences will be different. Now, one thing we have to ask ourselves is, why does this happen in the first place? So what makes official resistance or dissenting from within possible? And I have two basic explanations. There are more, but I have two basic explanations about why these type of things happen. The first reason these things happen, and I want to make it clear when I talk about resistance, about public officials who resist, I'm not talking at all about bureaucrats who are lazy, right? Or say, I don't want to come into work today, or I'll come into work, but I want to drink coffee and talk to my colleagues and not do any real work, and therefore I'll not do my job. I'm not talking about these cases at all. I'm talking about cases where officials understand what the law requires of them, and yet they decide to violate it for whatever reason, usually ideological, but it doesn't have to be ideological. So what makes all of this possible? One thing that makes it possible is that there are irresolvable tensions between the rule of law on the one hand, that requires universality and obedience, and the fact of human agency. On the one hand, the rule of law, of course, demands supremacy, especially of officials who are bound by the law and have to apply the law equally. So the rule of law for public officials is I call it a second order constraint on their first order preferences, right? They might agree with the policy, they might disagree with the policy, but the second order constraint is that, well, this is the law and we have to apply it whether or not we agree with the policy. But at the same time, the rule of law, of course, is not self-applying. It's not self-executing. No law can determine the scope of its own application. So on the one hand, officials have agency and they have whatever interest that they have. And those interests can often be part of their role conception. Those interests could be, for example, serving what they think is the public interest, but those interests can come into conflict. They can compete with law's demands, which generates a powerful tension. And the rules will sometimes not be enough to constrain official power. Now, of course, this is why we have courts, right? Where there's a violation, courts can impose the law also on officials who decide to violate the law. But the courts will always be only a partial remedy, because there are numerous ways to disobey court orders, which I will touch on in a little bit. But also, of course, many issues, for whatever reason, never reach courts, and they're never litigated. So number one is, of course, the tension between the rule of law on the one hand and human agency on the other. But what makes this also possible is the way that government or the state is organized, the way that it is structured. And this is pretty much an argument from institutional design. Most governmental organizations are built in a hierarchical way. But hierarchy, which is the point of hierarchy, is to ensure compliance, is never a complete safeguard against internal dissent, because hierarchy is never tight. There will always be overlaps, there will be conflicts, there will be problems of coordination, problems of coherence. And hierarchical structures, at best, can only generate or ensure local agreement. And therefore, this idea of this Weberian rationality of how organizations work just is not accurate. It's divorced from reality. It describes some of the ways that government organizations behave or operate, but it doesn't capture all of the types of behavior that actually occur. Think, for example, of numerous principal agent problems, right? So we have a lot of people doing a certain job, but we have very few supervisors on a lot of these people, right? So these supervisors can only supervise to a certain extent. They don't have control of everybody under their charge 24/7. So there will always be some spillage or some slippage, because they just can't control. Not all the information that will flow from the bottom up, and many people can fake compliance even if they don't. I mean, think just a random example. Think about a police officer who is walking the beat, right? Nobody's looking at what this police officer is doing at any minute of the day. He's just walking. And let's suppose that this police officer is pro-legalization, right? So his personal beliefs are pro-legalization of drugs, but of course he has to enforce the drug laws. But he's walking the street. The supervisor is not there. Nobody knows what he will do and not do. He sees somebody, I don't know, lighting a joint. And he decides, okay, I'm not going to approach that person, right? He's not doing anything. There's no supervision. He can completely ignore this illegal behavior if he wants to, and there will be no consequences to him ignoring the drug smoker. And this is just a small example, but of course there are many, many larger, sort of more serious examples. So that's on the level of and then maybe another tension that happens here is that there will always be a conflict between hierarchy, right? I have to obey my superior, and the rule of law. So there's an assumption that the rule of law and hierarchy go together, because what the superior will demand is also consonant with the rule of law. But it doesn't always have to be this case. What if, for example, you think the law requires you to do X, but your superior requires you to do Y? That's a tension that's yours. You'll have to choose one way or the other. But whatever you choose will have to be a violation. You're either violating your superior, which under the labor laws you have to comply with their orders, or you'll be violating violating the law. So these tensions are almost built into the state mechanism, and they're inescapable. And maybe the third thing that makes all of this possible is that we need to take into account how institutions, government institutions, but not just government institutions, operate de facto. Suppose there is a new law, that the Knesset passes a new law that requires a state unit to act in a way that it didn't have, that it didn't act before the law was passed. Many institutions that have done things for a long period of time are very much resistant to change. Right? I mean, first of all, we're all resistant to change on an individual level, but institutions also have a very, very strong status quo bias. They have a lot of sunk cost bias. And they have developed institutional identities that sometimes come into conflict with new legal demands that they have to comply. I'll just give one example, but there are many examples that you could give. Think about, this is kind of a more dated example. When President Reagan assumed office in the 1980s, he had this vision that all of the environmental regulation that's happening is, this is democratic nonsense, and what's important is business, and pollution is not such a big deal, and we should be more lax in our environmental regulation. And so he replaced the administrators of the Environmental Protection Agency, replaced many of the top bureaucrats, and everybody expected that enforcement, 2 minutes, okay, everybody expected that things will, be okay, in the sense that the goal will be achieved and that there will be much less regulation. But actually the opposite happened. There was more regulation of environmental infractions, even though Reagan slashed budgets and fired people. How was that possible? Because the EPA was very ideological against pollution of any sort, and it actually started alerting Congress to the problem. It started leaking information to the press. It ended up that the EPA administrator that Reagan appointed had to resign because of internal pressure in the EPA that refused to go along with the new measures. So that's just one example. And then I have 1 minute. Within 1 minute, I'll just say, if officials want to resist the law, and I'm not even talking about the normative implications of whether that resistance is good or not. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But they have many strategies by which they can go by and do it. For one thing, they can defy the order, right? They say, I'm not obeying. That will usually be very costly and will be very salient behavior. And so they won't do it unless they have some type of immunity or unless they're politicians. But there are a lot of other things that they can do, right? Of course, they can say, I'm complying, but I'm going to prioritize my priorities differently. So yes, I have to do this, but this is going to be now low on the level of what I want to do. And maybe I'll get to it in a month or two, or maybe I'll never get to it. There are other more important things I want to do, right? So I can deprioritize something. I can drag my feet. I can comply, but only partially comply. I can apply cosmetically. I can make it seem as if I'm complying, but in substance, I won't comply with anything. Or I can just ignore something when I think there's a very low chance of detection, and often there will be low chances of detection. So to sum up, and there are more, but I'm running out of time, just to sum out, what I think is, first of all, that legal theory and political theory needs a better account of resistance by public officials, because it's always focused on citizens who are resisting and not on public officials who are resisting. And we need to think about, after we have this account, we need to think also about what are the consequences of this type of resistance. Now, usually we would think it's terrible that people who are in charge of applying the law are not applying the law. They're not doing their job. The state is not doing their job. What does it mean for the rule of law? But of course, that is true, but there are also there can be also beneficial consequences to this type of resistance, right? So just for example, if a low-level official resists, that can sometimes alert us to a problem that the public is not even aware. And that can trigger change on its own. The resistance can trigger some sort of policy change. Sometimes the resistance will lead to more efficient arrangements because the complying with the law is not. And that's the final example I will end with. So I'll just give one example. And also from the EPA and from regulation from the Environmental Protection Agency. Empirical research that was done on regulation by EPA found out that many of the EPA regulators didn't enforce the regulations that they were in charge of enforcing. They were willing to overlook a lot of violations. And the question was why? Why are you resisting? Why are you not complying? And they said a lot of the regulation is silly. It's not really good regulation. It's not going to lead to good results. We would rather ignore all of these violations that are happening, because in exchange for us ignoring, we can achieve cooperation from corporations on the big things that matter, right? So they did the calculus of what's better, what's good. They realized that full enforcement is not never, but at least in this case, was not a good idea. They wanted to achieve meaningful compliance. So they were willing to overlook laws that they thought were not as important as the bigger laws that they had to comply with. And that's just one example, but there are many, many others, which I talked about in an article that I published years ago. But we need to have a better account of these kinds of behaviors, because we don't, A, and B, they're happening whether or not we have an account, so we better have an account for them. Thank you.